As an online competitive card game, it's no surprise that Hearthstone has its own ranked ladder system. The ranked system is divided into leagues, which is the typical bronze, silver, gold promotional system, and ranks, which are denoted by a picture of a Hearthstone card. Over the years, the ladder system has changed quite a bit to the current system, with the most iconic and most well-known cards being selected to represent each rank. And in this video, we'll be going over some of the best cards which are featured on the ranked ladder. So at number 10, we have Sir Finley Mrrgglton, who represents the Diamond 3 rank. This legendary 1-mana neutral minion has 1 attack, 1 health, and lets you choose a new basic hero power from 3 random options. Basic hero powers, for those of you who don't know, are a unique mechanic in Hearthstone, which are abilities that are specific to your hero's class and are only usable once per turn. Finley's effect is unique that you are able to choose a hero power specific to another class, which better fits your situation. Although Finley may seem pretty mediocre, especially considering how the most optimal decks want to use their inefficient hero powers few times per game as possible, his 1-mana 1/3 body was his main draw for quite a while. Before modern times, when a new 1/3 was printed every expansion, cards like Finley were quite rare, even if they didn't have an immediate threatening effect. In fact, for a decent amount of time, Diremaul, which was a vanilla 1-mana 1/3, saw a ton of play just because of how important that stat line was. In aggro mirror matches, being the first one to land a 1/3 on board would win you the game, since it could kill a whole bunch of your opponent's 1-health minions and stop them from ever establishing a board. And if you and your opponent both happen to drag out the game, you could always use the Hunter hero power, Demon Hunter hero power, or Warlock hero power that Finley gave you earlier in the game to help finish the game. These hero powers were really great to get, especially in decks like Pirate Warrior, which had a hero power that didn't synergize at all with its aggressive playstyle. Although Finley isn't played as much these days, his unique effect has found a surprising niche in Wild. You see, even though I said the basic hero powers are pretty bad, finding ways to upgrade or change your hero powers has defined some of the best decks in the format. So, what some tech-heavy decks would do is play Grizzled Wizard, which swapped you and your opponent's hero powers, play Finley, choosing the worst possible hero power for your opponent, and swap your hero powers back, essentially destroying the hero power your opponent's deck was built around. And for just 3 mana, this combo can still shut down the best decks in Wild, even if it is just a gimmick. And at number 9, we have Warsong Commander, which represents the Silver 7 rank. This 3-mana 2/3 warrior card lets any minions you summon with 3 or less attack enemies immediately, instead of having to wait a turn due to summoning sickness. This card, at its best, created one of the first instances of an extremely overpowered deck that the entire game had to warp around. So, what's so bad about giving a 3-attack minion charge? After all, it's not like it's that much damage. Well, if you're able to buff a low attack minion's health by a ton, like in the case of Frothing Berserker, it's pretty easy to see how problematic this card can become. Unlike in other card games, like Magic, where you can use any minion on your side of the field to block an attack, only minions with Taunt can block attacks on your opponent. And with the release of Grim Patron, which summoned another Grim Patron every time it survived damage, there were a ton of good targets for Warsong to give charge to. One of the more common combos with Warsong was to give a couple of Grim Patrons on board, play Warsong, play 2 Frothings, which gain attack every time a minion takes damage, and as many Whirlwind effects as possible. Not only would this juice up your Frothing Berserkers, which now each had charge, it would also give your newly summoned Grim Patrons charge too, in case your opponent had any taunts in their way. And since there was no standard/wild ladder split at the time, everybody had to suffer against Patron Warrior and the absolute blindside wins it could pull off. Since then, Blizzard has nerfed Warsong Commander to actually be unplayable garbage, with a slight buff doing nothing to help its play rate. Although Warsong was a beast during the early days of Hearthstone, and would probably see play nowadays in her unnerved form, I had to put her at number 9 on the spot just because of how long she's been bad for. And at number 8, we have Dr. Boom, which represents the Diamond 7 rank. This neutral 7-mana 7/7 legendary that summons 2 Boom bots when played, which are 1/1 mechs that deal between 1 to 4 random damage when they die. This card, for as simple and weak as it first seems, was another absolute monster in early Hearthstone and pretty much warped the first couple of years of metas around it. 7 mana is a lot to be paying for any cards nowadays. But other than Sylvanas and Ragnaros, Dr. Boom probably was the best value you could get for an expensive card in almost any deck. This card saw play in nearly every deck, from Zoo, mid-range, control, and even some supposedly aggro decks. Stats were very important, and Dr. Boom was by far the best value you could get for 7 mana. In addition to a 7/7 body that could trade into 2 to 3 other minions, Boom could go face for a lot of damage, and his boom bots could easily kill other minions for free or eke out just enough damage to kill your opponent. You see, because the boom bots can randomly target an enemy when they died, that meant they had the potential to go face for 8 damage, kill any enemy minions at 4 or less health, or do basically nothing. Running Big Game Hunter became a necessary staple just to counter Boom in Ragnaros. But even then, the boom bot still had the chance to get a lucky bomb off and even out the tempo lost. Eventually, he started being called Dr. 7 because he could usually win the game if played on 7 mana. Dr. Boom saw so much constant competitive play during the early years of Hearthstone that he became an iconic Hearthstone character, even if he wasn't in World of Warcraft. He even got his own hero card and starred in a ton of expansions, which is why he even got a rank portrait at all. That said, Dr. Boom is far too slow to see any play nowadays, but he definitely deserves a spot on this list for how much of a menace he was to early Hearthstone. And at number 7, we have Annoyatron, which represents the Bronze 6 rank. This 2-mana 1/2 neutral mech simply has Taunt, meaning enemies must attack into it, and a Divine Shield, which lets it ignore the first amount of damage it takes. For as silly as this card appears, Annoyatron is actually just good enough to see competitive play. It may surprise you to learn that a card with so few stats and only keywords even made it onto this list, but over the years, its unique packaging of effects have made it quite a good early game minion. At first, Annoyatron was used for its namesake, mainly as a cheap way to tank 2 of your opponent's attacks or to slow down aggro decks in early game. It could easily trade into 2 of your opponent's minions and could be a massive threat with just a couple of buffs. But what really made this card successful over the years were its common keywords and tags. In Standard, its Taunt keyword synergizes with the very good Razor main battle guard, and let this version of Aggro Druid easily swarm the board with 0 mana Taunt minions. Its even mana cost let it be included in Even Paladin, and was able to be pulled by Call to Arms and Protect for Watch Post, and Narubar Weblord, helping form the infamous Annoying Tax Paladin, which could shut down nearly every wild deck by turn 4. It was also part of the briefly S-tier wild deck Snip Snap Warlock. Basically, the 3-card, 5-mana combo revolved around creating free infinite copies of Snip Snap in your hand and attaching them to mechs, which included Annoyatron. And years later, with the release of the new and improved mech synergy cards, like Mech Shark, which is an insane OTK tool, and Radar Detector, which draws you 5 mechs, Annoyatron has seen renewed play in both Standard and Wild. Somehow, through all sorts of metas, Annoyatron always finds a way to be there, whether it be in the core set, in Battlegrounds, or even as a playable hero. It's no wonder this meek card found its way into the ranked ladder and onto this list. And at number 6, we have Sorcerer's Apprentice, which represents the Silver 10 ring. This 2-mana 3/2 mage minion simply makes all of your spells cost 1 less mana. For as unassuming as this card looks, any veteran card game player worth their salt will recognize how dangerous unconditional cost reduction of cards can be. For nearly all of Hearthstone's history, Apprentice was the number 1 reason why mages were one of the best classes at casting spells. And for good reason. With just a few ways to abuse casting cheap spells, Apprentice could very easily ensure that you could go through your entire deck and kill your opponent. Even back when Hearthstone didn't have a ton of spells or effects that could easily abuse the cost reduction of spells, Apprentice was played in every control, combo, and tempo mage variant out there. And with the introduction of Flamewaker, these two formed a duo that would be unmatched by any other tempo deck for a long time, between being able to spam cheap spells with Apprentice and pretty much always winning board control with Mana Worm. You pretty much always lost board control and eventually the game against most tempo mages. The flat discount on spells is so brutal that she's one of the truly must-kill minions in the game, otherwise your opponent can just really pop off on the turn after. And because Apprentice was in the classic set, she saw play even after other support cards rotated out. It's hard to understate how limiting she was, since I'm pretty sure she was the only reason Blizzard didn't print any cheap direct damaging spells in each other than Ice Lance. Years later, she re-emerged with Flamewaker with a ton of spell support cards. And honestly, I really have no idea what Blizzard was thinking when they printed even more spell cost reduction cards in Mage, with tons of ways to refill your hand. Unfortunately, she got obliterated with nerfs, where she got her mana cost doubled, and hasn't seen any play since then. But because of her massive impact in the game, she has helped shape the Mage class ever since. And at number 5, we have Shudderwock, which represents the Platinum 4 rank. This 9-mana 6/6 legendary shaman minion repeats all of your battlecry effects from other cards you played this game. And before you ask, no, it doesn't repeat its own battlecry when played, but it can with just a little bit of help from other cards. The Infinite Shudderwalk combo, as it was called, was actually really simple and just required you to play a card with the battle cry that summoned a copy of itself, and Grumble, which would return 2 1-mana copies of Shudderwalk back to your hand, essentially giving you infinite battle cries. When this combo was first discovered, it was nearly unbeatable in the standard ladder since most decks could not output enough pressure to kill control shamans by turn 9. And once you had enough 1-mana Shudderwalks in your hand, just about any battlecry effect you played previously in the game would be good enough to win the game. The only limitation was that Shudderwalk repeats your battlecries in a random order, and not in the order the minions were played, meaning there was always a chance that your Grumble battlecry would go off first before it could copy itself. But with more and more busted cards being printed into Shaman, there were always tons of redundancies and ways to ensure that you could always get your infinite Shudderwalk combo to go off. Some notable examples include playing multiple copies of the much better Serenite Chain Gang and the absolute insane Brilliant Macaw. I think Blizzard intended Shudderwalk to be played like a massive late game value bomb, like N'Zoth or Tess, or as a solid turn 9 value play and not to go infinite. Even now in Wild, Shudderwalk is the core win condition of Free Shaman, which abuses its multitude of freeze and lockdown and hand disruption battlecries to shut down just about every other deck in the meta. If you were ever around the time when Shudderwalk was first printed, you would understand just how defining and infamous he was to that time period of the game. And at number 4, we have Mountain Giant, which represents the Platinum 7. This neutral 12-mana 8/8 elemental costs 1 mana less for each other card you have in your hand. This giant has been around since the launch of Hearthstone, and has seen some sort of play through about just every meta. And although it is a neutral card, Mountain Giant saw near exclusive play in one class, Warlock. Whether it's just off the base hero power, or cost reduced one from Yen, or with the upgraded one, pretty much every non-aggro Warlock deck wants to press their hero power as much as possible since it actually generates card advantage. And because you're drawing so many cards with it, what would usually happen is that you would have to start dumping cards from your hand so that you don't overdraw. Mountain Giant fixes this problem by giving you a cheap threat to dump very early on in the game, costing as little as 3 mana with a full hand. And even though you can't ever get it to cost 0 mana under normal circumstances, this was enough of an upside that synergized with the Warlock hero power that every control and Reno deck started running it. Cube locks love this card since a turn 4 Mountain Giant into a turn 5 Carnivorous Cube would very easily win you the game. In Handlock, a turn 4 Mountain Giant was one of your best 4 plays, since you could copy its stats with Faceless Shambler or Faceless Manipulator. And even today, one of the best decks in Wild is Evenlock, which abuses its 1 mana hero power to abuse its other hand-sized cards that synergize with Mountain Giant. What really made this card such a beast was that dropping it against aggro decks meant that you could easily go 3 for 1, or just start crashing into face very quickly, threatening lethal. Or against the slow controller combo decks, you could also drop it to very quickly threatening lethal. It's not hard to see how an, on average, 4 mana 8/8, which rewards you for drawing cards, has seen a ton of play over the years. The only real disadvantage is when you're top decking with very few cards in your hand, but if you're ever in that position as a control deck, you've probably lost already. And at number 3, we have Greymane, which represents the Gold 4 rank. This 6 mana 6/5 neutral minion has the effect where, at the start of the game, if you built your deck so that it only has even costing cards, your hero power will permanently cost 1 mana. Gen is absolutely insane, even if he's actually just a vanilla 6 mana 6/5, because he helped define multiple tier 1 decks ever since his release. If you've ever heard us talking about an even deck before, Gen is the reason why those decks were named that way. He could very easily have an entire video about all the various competitive decks that he's ever been in over the years, so let us know if you want to see a video about that. Although, it may seem like making most hero powers cost 1 less doesn't sound that good, especially on effects that cost about 0 mana to begin with. Being able to spam hero powers for so cheap actually is a win condition that has enough synergy that's worth building a deck around. In fact, of all the basic hero powers, the only class I could think of that hadn't had a good even deck are Demon Hunter, because Gen's effect does nothing, Priest and Warrior, because their hero powers don't have immediate board impact. The first oppressive deck Gen spawned was Even Shaman, which was so good in Standard that Blizzard actually forcefully rotated him out early to the Hall of Fame, which was Hearthstone's version of the ban list. This deck tried to spam out 1 mana fire totems as often as possible with their hero power, capitalizing with other totem synergy cards and board swinging cards to absolutely steamroll the ladder. And while there have been fringe even Druid, Paladin, and Mage decks, one of the big tier 1 decks nowadays has been even Warlock, which we talked about earlier on in a spot. But because Gen has been a more oppressive deck than Mountain Giant ever has, Gen definitely deserves to be in the top 3 on this list. And at number 2, we have Reno Jackson, which represents the Diamond 5 ring. This neutral 6 mana 4/6 legendary minion restores your hero to full health, but only if your deck contains no duplicate cards in it. Unlike Again though, your deck only has to contain unique cards in it by the time you play Reno, meaning you could potentially build your deck to contain a couple of duplicates, draw them, then be able to play and activate Reno. Reno is another card which could have its own entire video dedicated to the history of the decks that he's been in, but I'll give you the long and short of it. For Reno's entire lifetime, he has single-handedly stopped aggro decks from running rampant, and being the best deck in the format. This card is the namesake of his own deck format, is the bane of aggro decks, and is such a fan favorite that he spawned multiple other support cards to make it even better. And to players confused as to why healing your hero to full health with such a severe limitation has been good for so long, it's because this is actually all you need to do to beat many aggro decks in Hearthstone. From a deck building perspective, the ideal aggro deck kills your opponent as quickly as possible, efficiently using all of your mana, health, and cards to do so. In practice, that means aggro decks almost always run out of threats and burst quickly if you're able to survive their initial onslaught. And with other support and value cards, Reno decks have always been present as the premier control decks of Standard and Wild. So much so that aggro decks have been including counters just to stall Reno for a couple more turns. Some examples of when Reno was at his best was in Raza Priest, which used Raza and Shadow Reaper Anduin to get 0 mana Void Form, LPG Mage, which abused the 5 mana Luna's Pocket Galaxy, and Big Demon Reno Lock, which cheated out wave after wave of big demons. In fact, Reno Priest and Reno Warlock were so good for so long that people had concluded that cards would never be good enough to ever shake up the meta. And, well, they were wrong, but not by that much. Reno Warlock still manages to see play in today's extremely fast combo meta, mainly through teching in enough instant win conditions against certain decks. As much as it pains me to put Reno at number 2 spot, again, the number 1 spot on this list has been undeniably insane in the last couple of years. And at number 1, we have Molten Giant, which represents the Platinum 6 ring. This neutral 20 mana 8/8 elemental costs 1 mana less for each point of damage your hero has from full health. So for example, if your hero is at 10 or less health, then Molten Giant will cost 0 mana. This card, despite requiring you to enter critically low life totals, is just absolutely insane when you start realizing how many cards synergize with losing health. In, you guessed it, Warlock. This card was a core part of the 4 Giants variant of Questline Warlock, one of the few S-tier decks in Hearthstone's history. This deck focused around damaging your hero as much as possible to trigger all 3 steps of the questline, to get the reward Blightborn Tasman, which makes all damage you take on your turn damage your opponent instead. To get this reward, the deck would stuff in as many cheap damaging cards as possible and Dark Glare to cheat them all out for free, since it restores mana every time you take damage. And while you may not deal enough damage to yourself to get the reward every game, that's why the Giants were also in the deck. Flesh Giant cost 1 mana less each time you damaged or healed yourself, and Molten Giant cost less when you were low, meaning that they could very consistently cost 3 or less mana by the time you drew them. This deck basically had no weaknesses, since you could heal out of range very quickly, out-damage just about every deck, and have an insane board presence with the Giant variant. And it's not like the 4 Giants variants came out of nowhere, since before the questline was printed, it was also one of the main variants of Dark Glare Warlocks, which was the sole tier 1 deck for quite a while in Wild. The only low point in this card's history was when it was nerfed to cost 25 mana, but even then it was included in some Mimi Holy Wrath Paladin decks. Molten Giant definitely deserves to be number 1 spot on this list for its inclusion into a deck so good that its core card had to get banned in Wild. And because no other card on this list can brag about that, even Reno, the infamous Molten Giant definitely deserves its top spot on this list. Alright, and that's the list. If you have any ideas for future videos just like this one, be sure to let us know down in the comments.